I want to welcome everybody to the next in our series of Webinar Wednesdays for VITA, the Integrated Services Program. I'm Steve Marzoff, your Cruise Director, we do these to try and relay information and also solicit input or feedback. So again, if you can mute your phone as we're doing it, that's wonderful. If you have a question, please feel free to unmute and interrupt us as we're presenting so that we can go ahead and get your question answered. We will have question answer period at the end as well. If you want to hold your question until the end, that's fine too. But what we wanted to talk to you today about was the data analytics project. We have done prior webinars on it. We also had a presentation to the Regional Advisory Council and a couple different presentations to the E911 Services Board. But the E911 Services Board did take action at their last meeting to advance the project, so we wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that. And then there's a few questions that they've asked us to come back to this to their next meeting on May 12th to present to them. And so we want to make sure everyone within the local government community, both the PSAP managers and the GIS managers that are interested, know what it is that's being proposed, know what it is that we're trying to do, and be able to provide feedback if you have any concerns with any of that before we go to the board meeting on May 12th. Again, the conferences, these webinars are recorded, and we do try and get them online. It takes us a little bit of time sometimes to get them online, but we're trying to catch up with all of those as well. You go to the ISP website, and you'll see the webinar series link towards the bottom of the page on the left. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie McGuffin, our regional coordinator from the Appomattox region, Region 3, who's going to run through where we are with data analytics and where we're going. It's all yours, Stephanie.
All right. Thanks for the introduction, Steve. So I wanted to spend some time during today's session to review with you kind of the problem statement and the kind of the current situation. We'll then explain how this analytics project will be beneficial to 911, the system currently, and then also as we transition to next-gen 911. Then we'll talk about the E911 Services Board action and direction from their March meeting, as Steve explained. We'll talk some about and explain the resolution to some of the questions or concerns that have come up by both our stakeholders in this project and by the 911 board, and we'll review that by going over some of the information that's in the final data sharing agreement. And then finally, I'm going to explain what recommendations regarding deployment staff will be making to the board at their May 12 meeting. So that's what we hope to cover today. So like Steve said, as I'm going through, if you do have a question, feel free to unmute your phone and let us know your question or comment. So the problem statement regarding data analytics is that really at this time there is a minimal amount of data collection that is currently happening in regards to the 911 network and how it performs. So there's no data on the existing network as it relates to the routing of wireless 911 calls, the location data and other information that's provided by the wireless carriers to the dispatchers as they receive 911 calls. We don't know much about the length of time it takes for call setup and delivery of calls into the PSAP. And these are some things that we really need to take a look at and understand how they're functioning both now and as we do transition to next-gen 911. We also know that it is a guiding principle of both the ISP and overall the 911 Services Board to make sure that we do not degrade service. as we implement some next-gen 911 technologies, of course, that's going to change some of the functioning of the system. So we need to make sure that 911 calls are still being sent, received, and processed in the most efficient way possible. So we need to be able to monitor the system performance now so that we get a baseline understanding of how it's performing and how information and calls are traveling through, and then to also use that data to make sure in the future service isn't degraded at all. So to accomplish those things, we know that it's going to be important that we have a standard Commonwealth-wide reporting tool. And this tool would be able to give us a data-supported understanding of, again, that current functional levels of 911, both operationally and systemically, and then also an understanding of the impact of next-gen services on those functional levels. So the tool that has been selected as that standard reporting tool is a product called ECATS. And again, this is an MIS call accounting solution that's going to provide a consistent and comparable data among all the PSAPs in the Commonwealth. So I wanted to also go over again some of the things that we hope to accomplish and use the ECATS solution for to help us in all the things I mentioned previously. So as I said, ECATS is an MIS or call accounting solution. It does basically the things that other solutions out there will do, but it also has additional functionality that we are looking at on a state level to again, help us understand the system. So it does collect and analyzes 911 data in the same manner from every place where it's installed. So for one thing, we would be able to use this comparable data to gather that annual true-up information. Every year we go through a process where we get some call load data from all the PSAPs. Sometimes there's a question with that data and how accurate it is. So again, we know if everyone's on the same system, we're comparing apples to apples when we collect that data and utilize it for the funding that the PSAPs receive. We also know with the ECAT solution we have the ability to acquire that baseline data so that we can measure the performance of the 911 network overall. Again, that's network level, not at a PSAP level. And then we'd also have the ability to analyze future data, again, making sure that transition to 911 doesn't adversely affect the 911 call delivery or processing. ECATS also has the ability to do a lot of data collection and analysis regarding wireless 911 call delivery. They have the ability to look at the number of call transfers and run statistics on those data that will help us maybe streamline some of the wireless 911 call routing so that we can ultimately reduce response times. We have found in the pilot project that we did and through other users that we've talked to that this, and our own experience, that this is really a more user-friendly tool than some of the existing MIS in place at PSAPs now. It again is fairly easy to use and helps. Because of that, it will be able to help the PSAPs evaluate their operations within their centers more effectively. So overall, it's a tool that will give us the ability to make better, well-informed, data-driven solutions, both at a state level as we look at the 911 network as a whole, and for the PSAPs at the local level as well. So as it was mentioned at the beginning of the call, at their March 12th meeting, the E911 Services Board did approve an allocation of $1 million of existing budgeted funds to put toward this project. The goals here, of course, of the board are to deploy ECAT statewide. That includes the 121 primary PSAPs that we have. And to really start that process and start the data collection as soon as possible. The more data that we have in the collection of data is going to help us analyze that and make the decisions we need to. So we want to start as soon as possible to start building our data sets. So those were the actions and the goals of the board. And they did have some discussion and wanted some further resolution to the data sharing agreement. So we do have a data sharing agreement in a final state now, and we're going to go over some of the points in that data sharing agreement. And most of the questions and concerns that we've heard from the PSAPs in general and from our board were questions regarding FOIA and records retention. So in the next few slides, I'm going to go over some information regarding resolutions to those questions. And then they also wanted to continue talking and considering of the deployment methodologies. How do we actually get this out and installed at the 121 PSAPs across the Commonwealth? So there was discussion about doing this on a voluntary basis or as a mandatory option. So again, later in the presentation, we'll talk about those two things and the plan or path forward. So the data sharing agreement will be an agreement that will be entered into between the PSAPs and the E911 Services Board. And the data sharing agreement it's only about 3 pages long, and the kind of 3 main topics that the data sharing agreement talks about and looks at is the level of access, the issue of FOIA or access to specific data, and then records retention. So first I wanted to take a minute and talk about the access levels. So in the data sharing agreement, or through the data sharing agreement, PSAPs will have the ability to choose from 2 different levels of access that they can grant to the wireless board and IFP staff. The first level is to give unrestricted access to all the ECAS reports. That's one option. Another option is to give access to the board and staff through limited reports. And you see on this slide is a listing of all the reports that we would have access to. There's about 12 or 14 reports there. So I will note that the reports that you see in red are reports that we would want access to, but that are only aggregated at the state, at a statewide level. So, for example, that PSAP answer time. For us at the state level, we would be able to see that as an average or a whole across the state. We would not be able to see specific PSAPs call to answer times. So that's what all those in red are for. And then, of course, the others would be specific to PSAPs, but are necessary for us to do some of the analysis that we want to do, and in working with the PSAPs, if they need assistance in any of their steps that they want to take, for example, looking at wireless transfer summary reports and having us help them figure out what is the best way to have their wireless calls routed. Do they need to change some of their sector routing? How do they move through that process? So that's what these reports are going to be used for. So as I said before, we're in the final draft of the data sharing agreement. We've come to that final draft through a few revisions, feedback from the PSAP community, feedback from the Regional Advisory Council that's been established. But we've also had conversation with the board's representative from the Office of the Attorney General, and he has reviewed the agreement and had discussion with us. So in light of that, one of the things that we've included or put into the agreement now is to clearly identify that the PSAPs are the owners and the custodians of this data. the data belongs to the PSAP. It is not the state's data. We will not act like it's our data. So in regards to FOIA requests or requests for data, if someone requests data from the board or ISP staff, that person will be referred to the PSAP to receive that data. The PSAP is then able to respond to that requester based on their data sharing policies and decision making. So, following code, however the PSAP responds to that is up to the PSAP. Now, requests that come to the board or staff for those aggregate or statewide data reports that I showed on the screen before, those ones in red, if we get requests for those reports, then because they are aggregated, we are the only ones that have access to that information, then we would have to provide that according to our policies and decision making. So I will take a pause right there and see if anyone has any specific questions about FOIA or anything we've covered so far. I think that our refinement of this has hopefully answered a lot of questions and maybe put down some of the concerns that were out there. So does anyone have any questions? All right, I'll take that as a good sign, and I will move on. Can anyone hear me? How about that?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So next slide is about records retention. So you'll hear me say it again. Regarding records retention, again, the PSAPs are the owners and the custodians of this data. So in regard to records retention, each PSAP is going to be responsible for ensuring that the data held in ECATS is preserved, maintained, and accessible throughout the life cycle of the data. So, whatever schedule the library has established for these types of data, it's up to the PSAP to make sure that they're able to preserve it and have accessibility to that data. The PSAPs, again, are going to be the ones who are responsible for making decisions regarding the retention and destruction of data in ECATS and regarding creation and retention of local copies of data in ECATS. So it is, in conversations that we've had with ECATS, it is the policy of ECATS, their parent company is Direct Technology, that they will hold this data in perpetuity, pretty much forever. They've had ECATS established and live in California for, I think, about 10 years now, and they have all the data for all 10 years. I don't think they've ever purged that data. So it's their policy that they will hold data and retain that data for as long as forever. However, if a PSAP would like to make sure they adhere closely to the schedule of the library, and if there's a 3-year time period for retention of data, if they want to have ECATS purge that data after that time period, that is going to be something that the PSAPs will work out with ECATS, and that is spelled out in the data sharing agreement. As we kind of move through that process, after we find out what direction the board gives at their next meeting, and we start working individually with PSAPs about these types of things. If you have questions for us regarding your individual case, for your records retention, things like that, we will, of course, offer advice to you and help you work through that process. All right, so those are kind of the main things regarding the data sharing agreement and the resolution to some questions about that. The other thing that we wanted to discuss was this notion of whether or not the implementation or installation of ECATS should be voluntary or mandatory. And the board did have a fairly good bit of discussion about this issue. And it was really the sense that we got from the board, and their kind of leaning was toward having a mandatory installation with exception. So what we want to and will be recommending to the board at their May 12 meeting is a conditionally mandatory participation based on financing. So basically what this means is as long as the board pays for ECATs, again, that's, we have the money allocated, that's the plan that we will pay for ECAT. So as long as the board is paying for it, the PSAPs must participate. If a PSAP refused or didn't participate for some reason, then that would affect their ability to get grant funding through our PSAP grant program in the future. We also want to establish an exception process where don't have it completely ironed out, all the criteria, and really the process of how that will happen at this time. But basically, if a PSAP is able to show some considerable or overwhelming hardship as to why they couldn't have ECAPs in place, we would need to talk about that. We would need to make sure that because we want to be able to use this data to monitor the performance of the network and the performance of the carriers and the functioning of the network now and in the future, we need to make sure that if a PSAP does need to apply for an exception, that if they were to get that, they would be able to provide the necessary data to us in some format. So that needs to be considered and make sure that's a possibility. And then also this exception process is going to be something that will take board approval to actually get an exception. It will have to be taken to the board, and the board will have to vote on that. But there is a process if it needs to be considered. All right. Once again, I'll take a little break and see if anyone has any questions so far. All right. I guess I'm answering everyone's questions. That's wonderful. So then I also wanted to go over a little bit of the continued planning and outreach that we're doing. Of course, we're on this webinar today, so that's good. I appreciate everyone who's on here and listening. I'm also going to be doing next week at the NENA conference on May the 5th. That's already next week. I'll be doing a status update. It will basically be the same information, so sorry for that if anyone is going to be there to hear it again. But the other exciting part of that presentation is going to be that we are going to do a demonstration of the ECATS product. So if you're interested in seeing the product, again, we've done a few demonstrations. If you haven't made it to those in the past and want to actually see the product and how it works, please come to that session at the conference next week so you can see the product in action there. And then again, at the board meeting on May the 12th is when we'll seek further action from the board. So those are some of the outreach and continuing trying to get the word out to everyone. But we also are working on kind of the implementation plan or the rollout of actually getting ECATs installed at all the PSAPs. We're working with the vendor on a time frame and scheduling. Of course, like I said, there's 121 PSAPs across the state, so we really have to have a methodical way that we do these installations. We can't be jumping all over the state, so we have to have a process and a plan in place to get that out. So everyone's not going to happen at once. It is going to have to be rolled across the state, so we'll just have to, again, continue working with the vendor to figure that out. As soon as we know what that looks like, we will get the information out to the PSAPs. We also need to work on establishing these roles and responsibilities. What is it that the board and ISP staff need to do, and what information is it that we need to get out and make sure the PSAPs are having understanding of? What are the responsibilities of ECATs in working directly with the PSAPs? And then, of course, what are the responsibilities of the PSAPs? So we want to make sure that everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing and what they're responsible for. I'm going to have a procedures or a to-do list Again, there are things that we as ISP staff and board staff will be working with the PSAPs on, but then you're also going to be in contact with ECAT staff to make sure that everything is in place to get the system installed. So I want to make sure that I have call it your ECAT welcome packet, data analytics welcome packet, or something like that, where we're showing you all the things that have to take place. We are explaining with you the data sharing agreement, acquiring signatures to that agreement, asking questions or answering questions for you, making sure you're getting your IT folks involved so they understand what's coming with the project, just getting everything lined up and ready for the actual installation. So those are the things that we're going to be doing pretty much right after May the 12th, and we know the decisions of the board. We're going to start really reaching out individually to PSAPs and moving through the process. I've tried very hard during this whole project planning the past over a year now in making sure that I'm keeping everyone informed and up to date with what's going on. I know that as PSAP and local staff, you guys have a lot of other things that you're trying to pay attention to. So if you feel like you're missing some information or just not fully understanding what's happening, I understand that. So please feel free to reach out to me and ask me questions. You can certainly reach out to your your ISP regional coordinator for questions and answers as well. But I want to make sure that everyone is feeling comfortable with this. They're understanding what's going to be happening. So again, if you have any questions or kind of see any holes in our ability to get this information out to everyone, please let me know that. And actually, that was the gist of the information I wanted to share with everyone today. So, Steve, did you have anything specific that you wanted to add?
The other thing I would add is a couple things. One is we recognize that this is a new arena. The board up to this point has asked for only basic information: total number of calls, total wireless 911 calls, and personnel costs. So we are getting into a new arena here. And we have had some concern expressed by people of, well, what are you going to do with the data and the release? And I hope we've dealt with the FOIA issue and the records retention issue satisfactorily. And I will tell you that when we presented to the board at the last board meeting, when they approved the $1 million to move forward, we had proposed a voluntary deployment strategy or methodology, and it was actually the board that pushed and said, we think we really need this data, so maybe a way of doing it mandatory, but I think there was apprehension about this notion of, well, let's just make it unconditionally mandatory. So that's why we try to come up with kind of a middle ground with the conditionally mandatory with exception option there. We have presented it to the Regional Advisory Council, who represent not only the PSAP community but also GIS and IT community around the state. I won't say they were thrilled with the idea of it being mandatory, but at the end of the day, one of the RAC members asked the other members, is there anybody who really objects to it? And there really wasn't any objection. So we know this is new territory. We know this is maybe a little bit difficult to love, but we think the benefits to the Commonwealth as a whole, not just the board, but even to the PSAP community and also the leadership is of local government and state government is going to be very valuable, because we'll for the first time have some objective measures of how well the overall network is performing. Are we routing calls? And when I say we, I don't mean PSAPs and ISP, but even the carriers and Verizon and CenturyLink. Are we routing calls to the best of our ability or the best way possible? Are we getting our money's worth, as it were? So I think it's important that we go into this eyes open and communicating it all. There is no hidden agenda here. What you see is what you get. And we'd really encourage you to come to the conference next week. If you haven't seen the product and come to the demo, we've been very impressed with it. But that we want to make sure that it meets your needs as well, because the other thing I would mention is the grant committee is suggesting, as part of the 2018 guidelines, that this becomes the de facto call accounting system for the Commonwealth. Now, if you're buying call handling equipment and you want to go ahead and add call accounting with it, like Aurora Analytics or Power MIS stats or whatever to it, you're more than welcome to. But so far as going out and buying a standalone call accounting system, that would come out of the guidelines as a allowable expense because the board's already providing this. So, we're jumping into this, a new area, and we want to make sure everybody's comfortable with it and understands. And I do see we have a couple questions that came in on the chat. One says, so the state will be paying all the costs? The answer is yes. We will be funding the ECATS cost, which is the initial installation, as well as a monthly recurring cost. But we also know that from our pilot that there's two other potential costs. Not everybody will have them. One is to activate the call detail record port on the call handling equipment. That's an issue with Airbus. If it's not activated, it needs to be activated and costs somewhere around $3,000, $3,500. And then we've run into some IT costs with localities that had a switch that was full and they didn't have any more ports available because we do need to have an internet connection. So we have expanded switching capability, network switching capability. And, that typically has been just a couple $100. We're not going to buy an $8,000 managed switch, but we will buy a couple $100 switch to expand capability. We're not going to buy a 96-port switch. We'll buy a 10-port, 20-port, something like that switch or something like that. So all identified costs that are a result of this, we absolutely will fund. And there's also a question, will there be direct interface from our ECATS to the state, or will you need to access our network, or will we just send the reports manually? No, the records for the data is stored in the cloud, so we don't have to access your network at all. And we would be accessing the reports directly on the ECATS interface, just like you would be. Now, we wouldn't see, if you don't want us to, if you want to give us unrestricted access, then you'd be able to do that selecting option A according to the data sharing agreement. But if you wanted to restrict our access to only the reports the board has identified that they need, then you would be able to do that. So we wouldn't see all your reports, but we'd see some of the reports, like the transfer reports, because we have to be able to look at the which calls are being transferred and where and that sort of thing. And then the statewide reports that Stephanie mentioned, those ones that were in red, like the call, the answer time, PSAP answer time statistics, statewide, not for individual PSAPs. So no, we wouldn't need to have access to your system at all. But are there other questions or thoughts or concerns? Again, we'd much rather hear them now than when we're at the board meeting on May 12th. I just got another one on the chat that says, is there a date that you want all PSAPs to have this installed? What our goal is definitely by the end of the calendar year. We want to start deploying as soon as possible, so probably will end up being the middle to end of May by the time we get all of the requisitions and things like that in. And then we would be hopefully wrapping up by the end of the calendar year with all the deployments. That's the timeline that ECATS has provided us so far. Now, as Stephanie mentioned, if the board does agree with the conditionally mandatory with exception, we'll likely approach you about doing it in an organized way, starting east, moving west, starting west, moving east, doing it by region, doing it by some methodology. So while we've already had some regions and several PSAPs say, put me on the list, I want to be first, I want to be early on, we'll work with you the best we can, but for the most part, if we are going to do this statewide and it's going to be mandatory, then we're going to want to do it, in a way that reduces the cost to doing that. I mean, we don't want to have to run the ECATS personnel all over the state. We'd rather do it, in an organized fashion. And I'm not sure we mentioned it before, but mandatory, what that means, because the board doesn't really have the authority to mandate this on a locality. It's tied to grant funding, just like the true-up. So right now, if you don't do a true-up, you're not eligible for grant funding. If you would say, forget it, I'm not letting you put this equipment in the PSAP, the result is you just wouldn't be eligible for grant funding. Any other questions, concerns, thoughts? I will tell you, too, that some of the PSAPs that were involved in there, localities that were involved in the pilot project, I would welcome you and encourage you to maybe reach out to them as well. Stanton, Augusta, Waynesboro, and Fluvanna. They've done a lot of work on the system and looking at different reports, and were the ones that reported to us that they found it to be a very valuable tool for them at the local level. So that would be, if you want to hear firsthand experience from the PSAP perspective or local government. And when I say local, there are in at least one locality, they downloaded the data, some of the data, to their GIS, and the GIS staff is actually doing some analytics, spatial analytics, given the data that from the system. And that's been they've reported to be very interesting and valuable as well. Any other questions, comments? Well, you're letting us off the hook easy today.
I'm going to go with the thought that we've answered all their questions. Everyone's feeling good and comfortable.
Well, hopefully this isn't the first time you heard of this. Hopefully you're comfortable with the direction we're going forward. If not, please reach out to your regional coordinator. You can reach out to Stephanie also directly, or myself, or Dorothy. We're happy to try and answer your questions. If your locality or region is interested in a demonstration of the product by itself, because you're looking at call accounting system anyway, we can arrange that. Either prefer it at a regional level if we can, to get as many at one time, but if you want to do it individually, we can do that as well. If you're, it is something that will involve your local IT, because we will need to have an internet connection. It is a push-only connection, so there's no inbound traffic. It's only outbound traffic. That has relieved and resolved some security concerns from IT folks otherwise. But we want to make sure everybody understands and is comfortable with the direction forward, so it doesn't feel like this is the state trying to cram something down people's throats, because it so far hasn't. That's not how this effort's been pushed by the board, and I don't think the board wants it to feel like that or to be like that. They want it to be a partnership between the localities and the board, so that we can manage this deployment of next gen moving forward. Stephanie, any last comments or you wanted to add?
I don't think so. Like Steve said, I do plan on, after we get some final direction from the board on May 12th, I do want to offer some demonstrations through webinars, so you'll be getting some notification about that. But that's all for today, and I appreciate everyone's time and attention, and we finished a little early, so you can get a little time back in your day.
We hope you'll be at the conference next week, and if not, please reach out. And also remember, the draft data sharing agreement is on the website and will be presented to the board at their meeting as well. So please feel free to download that and circulate it. And if you have any questions on that, we'd really appreciate that feedback as well. Nothing else. You all have a great day. Thank you very much for participating, and we'll be doing it again soon. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.